Hey boys and girls, how are you? So it's a little later in the day today, but I wanted to go ahead and read through our next chapter of Beezus and Ramona. And it's going to seem a little bright, but this is one of my favorite times of day to sit and read right before dinner. And I like to sit in the sunshine, so you'll see the sun kind of shining in on me. I hope that's okay. I'm here just feeling comfortable on my couch and thought I would catch up on a little reading with you. So when we had left off, when we had finished chapter 1, we had discovered and met Ramona, who was a very mischievous little 4-year-old girl, and her sister Beezus. And Ramona had borrowed a book from the library, if you remember, and then she wrote all in it because she thought that book belonged to her, and she scribbled what she thought was her name in that book. So she ended up having to pay for it, and then Beezus ended up being able to keep the book since the book was on Beezus's card. So that was better for Beezus because then she didn't have to read it all the time to Ramona. So I was noticing when we were reading this book, we've been talking about patience, that it's very hard for Beezus to be patient with her little sister Ramona sometimes because of some of the things that she does. So I'm sure some of you probably experience that sometimes if you have younger brothers and sisters or even older brothers and sisters, but that's one thing we're all learning how to do, aren't we? Be more patient. All right, so chapter 2, we did a little preview last time. This is called Beezus and Her Imagination. And if you remember, she was heading to an art class with Ramona. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Chapter 2, Beezus and Ramona both looked forward to Friday afternoons after school. Beezus because she attended the art class in the rec center in Glenwood Park. Ramona because she was allowed to go to the park with Beezus and play in the sand pile until class was over. This Friday, while Beezus held Ramona by the hand and waited for the traffic light to change from red to green, she thought how wonderful it would be to have Ramona's imagination. Oh, you know Ramona, her imagination runs away with her, Mother would say, when Ramona made up a story about seeing a fire engine crash into a garbage truck. That child has an imagination a mile long, the Quimby's grown-up friends would say, when Ramona sat in the middle of the living room in a plastic wading pool she had dragged up from the basement and pretended she was in a boat on a lake. Did you ever see so much imagination in a little girl? The neighbors asked one another when Ramona hopped around the yard and pretended she was the Easter Bunny. One spring day, Ramona had gotten lost because she started out to find the pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. The rainbow had appeared to end in the park until she reached the park, and then it looked like it was behind the supermarket. When the police brought Ramona home, her father said, "Sometimes I think Ramona has too much imagination." Nobody, reflected Beezus, had ever said anything about her imagination. She had wished more than anything that she had more imagination. How pleased Miss Robbins, the art teacher, would be with her if she had an imagination like Ramona's. Unfortunately, Beezus felt she was not very good at painting, at least not the way Miss Robbins liked boys and girls to paint. She wanted them to use their imagination and feel free. Beezus still got embarrassed when she thought about her first painting, which was a picture of a dog with bow wow coming out of its mouth in a balloon. Miss Robbins pointed out that only in the funny papers those are the comics, did dogs have bow wow coming out of their mouths. Miss Robbins did think one of Beezus's paintings was good enough to put up on the wall, but it always seemed to be down in the end in the corner, never in the middle. Beezus wished she could have a painting in the middle of the wall. "Hurry up, Ramona," she coaxed. Oh, there's an X word, coaxed, C-O-A-X-E-D. That means to get someone to come along. Then she noticed that her sister was dragging a string behind her. "Oh, Ramona," she said, "why did you have to bring Ralph with you?" Ralph was an imaginary green lizard. Ramona liked to pretend she was leading by a string. "I love Ralph," said Ramona firmly, "and Ralph likes to go to the park." Beezus knew it was easier to pretend along with Ramona than to make her stop. Anyway, it was better to have her pretend to lead a lizard than pretend to be a lizard. "Can't you carry him?" she said. "No," said Ramona, "he's slimy." When the girls came to the shopping district, Ramona had to stop at the drugstore scales and pretend to weigh herself while Beezus held Ralph's string. "I weigh 11 pounds, she announced, while Beezus smiled at Ramona's idea of her weight. It just goes to show how much imagination Ramona has, she thought. At the radio and phonograph store, Ramona insisted on petting the black and white plaster dog that was bigger than Ramona, that sat with one ear tilted towards the front door. Beezus thought admiringly about the amount of imagination it took to pretend that this chipped plaster dog was real. If only she had an imagination like Ramona's, maybe Miss Robbins would say her paintings were free and imaginative and would tack one in the middle of the wall. So there's Ramona. Oh, see, look. There she's pulling that imaginary string, so she has an imaginary lizard on that string. That is a good imagination, isn't it? Pretending. When we pretend things, that's when we use our imagination to make things up. And I'll bet Beezus does have a lot of imagination with her art. She just doesn't think she does. What do we always say about how do you get better at something? You just practice it, right? Sure. When they reached the park, Beezus left Ramona and Ralph at the sand pile, and feeling more and more discouraged about her own lack of imagination, she hurried to the rec center. The class had already poured paints into their tins and were painting on paper, thumbtacked to drawing boards. The room hummed with activity. Miss Robbins was wearing a paint-smeared smock, and she flew from one artist to another, praising and correcting and suggesting things. Beezus waited until Miss Robbins finished explaining to a boy that he should not outline a mouth with black paint. Then Beezus said, "Sorry I'm late," she said. She was staring in fascination at Miss Robbins' earrings. They came almost to her shoulders and were made of silver wire twisted and bent into interesting shapes. Not the shape of anything in particular, like a circle, just really interesting shapes. "That's all right," she said. "Get your paints and paper. Today everyone is painting an imaginary animal." An imaginary animal? Beezus repeated blankly. How could she possibly think of an imaginary animal? As Beezus poured paints into her tin, she tried to think of something, but all she could think of were regular animals: cats, dogs, cows, horses, lions, giraffes. They didn't seem like the right pick. Beezus took the only empty seat, which was beside a boy named Wayne, who came to the class only because his mom made him. Once Beezus had hung her sweater on the back of a chair, and Wayne had written on it in chalk. Beezus wore it all the way home before she discovered it. Since then, she did not really care to sit by Wayne. Today, she noticed he had parked a grape-flavored lollipop on a paper towel beside his muffin tin of paints. "Hi, Bees," he greeted her. "Please don't lick my sucker." That's another name for a lollipop. "I don't want your sucker," said Beezus, "and don't call me Bees." "Okay, Bees," said Wayne. At that moment, the door opened, and Ramona walked into the room. She was still dragging the string behind her, and she looked angry. "Why, hello," said Miss Robbins pleasantly. "Ramona," she said, "you're supposed to be playing in the sand pile," said Beezus. "No," said Ramona flatly. "Howie threw sand on Ralph." Her dark eyes were busy taking in all the paints and brushes and drawing boards. "I'm going to paint," she announced. "Mom said you were supposed to play in the sand pile," said Beezus. "You're too small for this class." "You say that about everything," complained Ramona. Then she turned to Miss Robbins. "Don't step on Ralph," she said. "Ralph is a make-believe green lizard she pretends to lead around on a string." Beezus was a little embarrassed having to explain this. Miss Robbins laughed. "Well, here's a little girl with a lot of imagination. How would you like to paint a picture of Ralph, Ramona?" Beezus could not help feeling a little annoyed. Miss Robbins was letting Ramona stay in the class. This was the one place where she was not allowed to tag along. Miss Robbins will probably like her painting since she has so much imagination. Ramona's pictures, in fact, were so full of imagination that it took even more imagination sometimes to figure out what they were. Ramona beamed, that means smiled really big, at Miss Robbins, who found a drawing board for her and a stool, which she placed between Beezus and Wayne. She lifted Ramona onto the stool. "There, now you can share your sister's paints." Ramona looked impressed at being allowed to paint with such big boys and girls. She sat very quietly on her stool, watching everything around her. "Maybe she'll behave herself after all," thought Beezus, as she dipped her brush into the blue paint. "And now I don't have to sit next to Wayne." Since Beezus still had not thought of an imaginary animal, she decided to start with the sky. "Do the sky first," Beezus whispered to Ramona. who looked as if she did not know where to begin. Then Beezus faced her own work, determined to be free and imaginative. To be free on a piece of paper was not as easy as it sounded. Miss Robbins always said to start with the big areas of the pictures and paint them bravely and boldly. So Beezus spread the sky on her paper with brave, bold strokes back and forth across the paper. She swept her brush. Brave and bold and free, that was the way to do it. There's Beezus and Ramona and Wayne and Miss Robbins. Her sky turned out to be too wet, so while it dried a little, Beezus looked at what the other boys and girls were doing. Celia, who had sat on her left, had already filled in a brave, bold background of pink, which she had sprinkled with big purple dots. Now she was painting a long gray line that wound all over her paper, in and out of the dots. Ooh, excuse me, boys and girls. Oh, sorry. What's that supposed to be? Whispered Beezus. I'm not sure yet, said Celia. Beezus felt better because Celia was the kind of girl who usually knew exactly what she was doing and whose pictures were often in the middle of the art wall. The boy on the other side of Celia, who always wanted to paint airplanes, was painting what looked like a giraffe made of pieces of machinery, and another boy was painting something that had two heads. Beezus looked across Ramona to Wayne. He had not bothered with a sky. He had painted a hen. Beezus knew it was a hen because he had painted in big letters, "This is a real hen," with an arrow pointing to it. Wayne always tried to do the opposite of what Miss Robbins wanted him to do. "Hey, quit peeking," he said in a loud voice. "I'm not peeking," said Beezus. Ramona had dipped her brush into blue paint and had painted a blue stripe across the top. "That's the sky," she said happily. "But that's not the way the sky is," Beezus said, trying to be helpful. She felt better because Ramona had not plunged in and painted a picture all full of imagination. "Skies come farther down on the paper," she said. "But the sky is up," said Ramona firmly. Beezus decided she couldn't waste time explaining about skies, not when she still hadn't thought of an imaginary animal. Maybe she could take a real animal and change it around. "Let's see," she said. "I could pick a horse and put feathers on it. Wings? A horse with wings was an imaginary animal. A real imaginary animal, because Mother had once read her a story about Pegasus, a winged horse, out of a library book. In the story, Pegasus had been white, which was a real horse color. So Beezus decided to be extra imaginative. She would make her horse green. A green horse against a blue sky. Miss Robbins ought to like that." Beezus did not think blue and green looked very pretty together, but Miss Robbins often liked colors that Beezus thought did not really go together. Beezus dipped her brush into the green paint and outlined a wing against the sky. Next, she outlined the body of a horse and a long tail that hung down. It was a magnificent horse. At least, Beezus hoped it would look magnificent when she was finished. Anyway, it was big because Miss Robbins liked her artist to cover the whole paper. Quickly and neatly, Beezus filled in the outline of the horse because Miss Robbins, who was looking at Celia's picture, would look at hers next. Somehow, the horse was not exactly what she had in her mind, but even so, she thought she did really well. Except for a few soggy places in her sky, her work was quite neat. Beezus waited for Miss Robbins to point this out. Instead, she said, "Celia, your picture is a work to be proud of. It's a difficult thing to get to be as free as this." Then she moved on to Beezus, her long earrings swinging forward as she leaned over her drawing board. Beezus waited anxiously. Maybe her picture wasn't as good as she thought. "You have a good sky, even if it's a little wet," said Miss Robbins. Beezus was a little disappointed. Anybody could have a good sky. Miss Robbins continued to study the picture. "Try to think how a horse would look as if it were really flying." Beezus tried to think. "What about the tail?" she said. "Wouldn't the tail fly out behind instead of hanging down?" "Especially if the wind blew hard," said Wayne. "Can you make the horse look rounder? Think of how a horse looks when the sun is shining on him. Part of him would be in the shadow." Not that horse, said Wayne. She just copied that off a billboard. I did not, said Beezus. Then she stared at her painting again. Now that Wayne had pointed it out, she could see her horse did look like the one on the billboard. He was a flat cardboard horse, not a magnificent horse at all. Her horse wasn't as good. Instead of a flying tail, he had one that hung down like a mop. Okay, Wayne, I'm sure Beezus did not mean to copy anything from a billboard. I didn't, she said. I was only trying to change a real animal to make it imaginary. I just don't have imagination. Oh, why, Beezus, of course you do, she said. Miss Robin sounded shocked at the idea of anyone not having imagination. My little sister has a lot of imagination, she said. Everybody says so. Miss Robin smiled. That doesn't mean that you don't have any. I think your trouble is you work too hard. You don't have to be so neat. Why don't you just start something else and just have fun with your paints? Beezus looked unsure. It was a nice change to have a grown-up tell her she didn't have to be neat, but she didn't understand how she could paint a good picture unless she really worked at it. If only she had some imagination like Ramona. But no, Miss Robin said everybody does. Well, if she had it, where was it? Beezus glanced at Ramona, who had been surprisingly quiet for a long time, to see how she was coming along with her picture of Ralph. Except for the stripe of sky, Ramona's paper was blank. Now she dipped her brush in yellow paint, divided the hairs of the brush, and pressed them on the paper, leaving tracks that looked like a bird. That's not really the way to use your brush, said Beezus. Besides, you're getting paint on your fingers. Look, Ralph's feet marks, she said. You mean footprints. No, feet marks, said Ramona, and I can't paint him because he's pretend. Well, thought Beezus, maybe making footprints isn't good for the brush, but it does keep her quiet. She dabbled her own brush in the green paint and tried to stir up her imagination. She felt a little encouraged because Ramona was having trouble. Hey, he interrupted Wayne in a loud voice. She's licking my sucker. Ramona! Beezus was horrified to see Ramona licking Wayne's grape-flavored lollipop. Ramona, put that down this instant. You're not supposed to lick other people's lollipops. You give me that. Wayne made a grab for his lollipop. No, screamed Ramona. I want it. Ramona, give it to him, she said. It's all germy. You mean she's getting germs on it. Give it to me. The rest of the class stopped, painting to watch what was happening. Wayne made another grab for his lollipop, but this time he got Ramona by the wrist. Let go, said Beezus. Ramona howled as Wayne tried to pry her fingers loose from the lollipop stick. He knocked against his muffin tin, which flipped into the air, splattering paint over the table, on the drawing board, on the floor, and Ramona was splashed with red and yellow paint. Blue and green ran down Wayne's jeans. A pool of brown dripped off the table onto the floor. Now see what you did, said Wayne, after he pried his lollipop out of Ramona's fist. See what you did, said Beezus, picking on my little sister like that. She picked up the paper towel and began to wipe the spatters off Ramona, and Ramona continued to howl. Oh, can you see her? Boys and girls, said Miss Robin, we need to be quiet. When the room is quiet, I know you're thinking. Lots of people don't know you have to think while you paint. Wayne, you may get a damp cloth and wipe up all that paint. I'm sorry, Miss Robin, said Beezus. I want the lollipop, screamed Ramona. Suddenly, Beezus decided she had had enough. This art class was the one place where Ramona was not supposed to be. She was supposed to play in the sand pile. Her mom had said so. She was not supposed to upset the class and spoil things. Ramona, stop that this instant, she said. Go out and play in the sand pile where you belong, or I'll tickle you, she said. I guess I do have some imagination, she thought. Instantly, Ramona stopped crying. She hugged herself and said, Don't tickle, Beezus, she said. Please don't tickle. Then you go out and play in the sand pile like Mom said you're supposed to. Don't tickle, shrieked Ramona as she scrambled down from her stool, and she ran out the door to the sand pile. Well, thought Beezus, it worked. Feeling suddenly lighthearted, she tacked a fresh sheet of paper on her drawing board. Maybe Ramona didn't have so much imagination after all. But if Ramona could do it, so could she. Beezus grabbed her brush and painted her sky in bold, free strokes. Then she dipped her brush into the green paint and started to outline a lizard on her paper. Let's see, what did a lizard look like? She could not remember, but it didn't matter. This was going to be an imaginary animal. Beezus promptly decided her animal looked more like a dragon. Dragons breathe fire, but she didn't have any orange paint. So she was late in starting the picture. She didn't want to take time to mix any. So she dipped her brush into the pink paint instead and made flames coming out of the dragon's mouth. But they didn't look like flames. They looked like cotton candy, the kinds you eat at the circus. A dragon breathing clouds of pink candy was a lot more fun than a regular one breathing fire. Forgetting everyone around her, Beezus made the pink clouds bigger and fluffier. Dragons had pointed things down their back, so Beezus made a row of spines. But they didn't look like it. They looked more like sticks. Lollipop sticks, of course, she thought. Beezus laughed to herself. Well, naturally, a dragon that breathed pink sugar-spun cotton candy would have lollipops down its back. She dipped her brush into the red paint and put a strawberry lollipop on one stick and then a grape on another. She was so pleased with her dragon. It was funny and colorful and imaginary. She wondered what Miss Robbins would say. Maybe she'd spoil her picture if she added anything else. No, she dipped her brush in yellow and gave the dragon a lemon drop eye. By that time it was 4:30, and most people had cleaned up. Several moms had come to pick up their children. Those who have finished, wash your hands, said Miss Robbins, and I mean clean. Then she came across the room. Why, Beezus, she explained, this is a picture to be proud of. I didn't know whether a dragon should have lollipops down his back, but it sure was fun to paint. Of course he can have lollipops down his back. It's a splendid idea. After all, no one's ever seen a dragon, so how would we know what it looks like? Here's a girl with real imagination, she said to the other mothers. Beezus looked modestly at her toes while the mothers admired her picture. We'll tack this in the center of the walls for next week's class to see, she said. There it is. Oh. You see the dragon? Yep, see the lollipops on it? Oh, so fun. It was fun to paint. Of course it was, said Miss Robbins. Didn't I tell you you worked too hard at painting before? You just need to have more fun. Beezus nodded. That was the wonderful thing about it, she thought. As she scrubbed her tin, her dragon had been fun, while her flying horse felt like work. And she had imagination. Maybe not as much as Ramona, but real imagination. A girl with real imagination, said her teacher. A girl who could think on her own, Beezus thought as she left the building and ran across to the sandpile. Come on, Ramona, she said, it's time to go home. She called to her little sister, who was happily sprinkling sand on a sleeping dog. And let's not forget Ralph, she said. Good old Ralph. All right, so chapter 3 is called Ramona and Ribsy. And I'll give you a little clue. Ribsy is a dog. So we'll see what happens in chapter 3. Here's a little peek at Ramona wearing those ears, riding that tricycle. So chapter 3 will be the next chapter we read. Okay, have a great night, boys and girls. Bye.